A black doctor was on his way to perform a life-saving surgery, carrying the weight of a critical mission. But when he arrived at the hospital, everything took a shocking turn. A group of arrogant colleagues, blinded by prejudice, humiliated him in front of the staff, refusing to let him into the operating room. Just 10 minutes later, an emergency call came in that changed everything. What happened next left everyone in disbelief and set in motion a series of events that would transform the hospital forever. Stay with me, this is a story you don't want to miss. Before we dive into it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Ava Johnson stepped onto the jet bridge with an air of self-assurance that turned heads. She carried herself with the kind of grace that suggested she had navigated far more turbulent spaces than an airport terminal. The tailored blazer she wore, her sleek dress, and the carefully polished leather laptop bag in her hand all spoke of someone who was no stranger to first-class cabins or first-class battles. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent with a polite nod and moved into the plane, her heels clicking softly on the carpeted aisle. Her calm confidence made people notice, but it wasn't loud enough to invite comment. Ava didn't seek attention. She sought to move forward, undisturbed and unchallenged. The first-class section was quiet, hushed in the way spaces designed for comfort often are. Ava found her seat quickly, sliding her bag into the overhead compartment with ease. She sat down, pulling out a slim notebook and a pen. Her fingers moved decisively, jotting down notes as she tuned out the murmured conversations around her. It wasn't that she ignored the other passengers, she simply didn't feel the need to perform for them. A flight attendant approached, her crisp uniform perfectly pressed, her name tag identifying her as Emily Brown. Emily moved through the cabin with sharp efficiency, her gaze scanning each passenger as though evaluating whether they belonged. When her eyes landed on Ava, her pace slowed. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice polite but carrying an edge that Ava had heard before. In countless other forms, in countless other places. "May I see your boarding pass?" Ava blinked up at her, surprised but not unsettled. She handed over the boarding pass without hesitation, her expression neutral. Emily examined it with the air of someone searching for an error. "This is for first class?" she asked, though the ticket clearly indicated that it was. "Yes," Ava replied evenly, her tone calm, almost bored. Emily's frown deepened, the lines in her face hardening as she handed the ticket back. She murmured something that sounded like, "Thank you," but her eyes lingered on Ava for a moment longer than necessary before she turned and walked away. Ava shook her head slightly, returning to her notes. She had no time to dwell on the moment. After all, it wasn't the first time she'd encountered a microaggression cloaked in professionalism. But as Emily passed the galley, she stopped to speak to another flight attendant, her voice low but audible enough for a few passengers to hear. "I'm not sure about her," she said, glancing back toward Ava. "She doesn't seem like the type." The words carried the weight of something unsaid, a murmur that echoed with centuries of exclusion, judgment, and suspicion. Ava didn't catch it, but the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, growing heavier by the minute. Minutes later, Emily returned, her posture more rigid, her tone more commanding. "Miss Johnson," she said, folding her arms, "could you step aside for a moment? There seems to be a mistake with your booking." Ava rose slowly, picking up her laptop bag as murmurs spread through the cabin. She followed Emily toward the galley, her steps measured and deliberate. Her mind raced with questions, but she kept her face composed. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a seat in the main cabin," Emily said, her voice sharp and unyielding. "It seems there's been an error." "What kind of error?" Ava asked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes held steady on Emily's. Emily hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an excuse. "I don't have time to explain. If you don't move, I'll have to involve security." Ava's heart clenched, but her face betrayed nothing. She knew what this was, not a clerical error, but a judgment passed silently, a decision made without facts. Still, she nodded once, quietly gathering her belongings and walking toward the economy section with Emily at her side. The whispers in first class grew louder, the stares more pointed. As Ava walked the length of the plane, some passengers averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the injustice playing out before them. Others leaned toward one another, exchanging knowing looks that said they had seen this kind of thing before. Ava took her new seat in the cramped middle row of the main cabin. She set her bag beneath the seat and folded her hands in her lap. Staring out the window, her expression remained calm, but her grip tightened ever so slightly. Back in first class, Emily moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of control. Her steps brisk, her smile forced. She had won the moment. But a shadow of doubt crept into her thoughts. Something about Ava's composure unsettled her. In the main cabin, Ava pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly as she sent a text. The message was brief but deliberate. "Something happened. I'll need your help when we land." She slid the phone back into her bag and leaned back in her seat. Watching the clouds drift by, Ava knew better than to confront the moment head-on. Change didn't come from shouting, it came from precision. From turning the quiet storm of injustice into something no one could ignore. Outside, the engines hummed steadily, propelling the plane forward. Inside, a larger storm was brewing, one that neither Emily nor the airline was prepared to face. The air in the cramped economy seat was heavy, but Ava Johnson sat upright, her posture unyielding despite the oppressive closeness of the space around her. The seat was narrow, the armrests worn smooth from years of overuse. This wasn't where she belonged, not by ticket, not by merit, and certainly not by dignity. But here she was. Passengers around her cast quick, sidelong glances, their curiosity flickering before they turned back to their screens or magazines. Few would ask questions, though many would quietly wonder why a woman like Ava, polished, poised, first-class material in every sense, was sitting among them. But those wonders would remain unspoken, buried beneath the surface of polite avoidance. Where so many uncomfortable truths lived. The flight attendant assigned to economy, a younger woman named Clara, approached cautiously. Her eyes were wide with concern, her movements hesitant as she knelt beside Ava's seat. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara's voice was soft, kind, so different from the clipped efficiency Ava had faced in first class. Ava looked up, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm fine," she said evenly, though the warmth in Clara's tone chipped away at the wall Ava had constructed around herself. "If there's anything I can get you," Clara added, lowering her voice further, "please don't hesitate to ask." Ava's smile widened slightly. "Thank you, Clara. I appreciate that." As Clara walked away, Ava turned her gaze back to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds outside. The world out there seemed infinite, unbound by the restrictions of human judgment. But in here, in this confined space at 30,000 feet, the boundaries were as clear and unyielding as the seatbelt sign overhead. Back in the first-class cabin, Emily Brown busied herself with her duties, her movements brisk and practiced. She served drinks, adjusted luggage, and smiled at passengers with a mechanical precision that betrayed her inner unease. Every few minutes, her eyes flicked toward the galley, as if expecting a reprimand that had yet to come. "Everything okay?" asked Dennis, a senior flight attendant with years of experience etched into the lines of his face. His tone was casual, but his gaze was sharp, piercing through Emily's veneer of composure. "Of course," Emily replied quickly, her smile too bright, too forced. Dennis raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. He had seen flight attendants like Emily before, young, ambitious, and quick to let their biases guide them. But this time, he had a feeling she'd picked the wrong passenger to cross. In the main cabin, Ava's phone buzzed quietly in her lap. She unlocked it with a swipe, her eyes scanning the screen as a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. The message was brief. "We're monitoring the situation. Let us know if it escalates." She slipped the phone back into her bag, her calm composure unbroken. The airline's executive office was already aware of what had happened. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. The minutes stretched on, the hum of the airplane engines a steady backdrop to the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Ava didn't need to act in haste. She knew that change was never rushed. It came like a tide, slow, deliberate, and unstoppable. Meanwhile, Emily's discomfort was growing. Every interaction she had with a passenger felt heavier, as if Ava's quiet presence in economy had shifted the weight of the entire plane. She couldn't understand it, why this one woman, who had complied without argument, left her feeling so unsteady. It wasn't guilt, at least. Not the kind of guilt Emily was willing to name. It was something more insidious, more deeply rooted, a doubt that whispered in the back of her mind, challenging the assumptions she had clung to so tightly for so long. Dennis noticed her unease and cornered her in the galley. "Emily," he said, his tone sharper now, "did you verify that passenger's ticket before you moved her?" Emily stiffened. She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I just had a feeling something wasn't right." "A feeling," Dennis repeated, his voice flat. "You moved someone out of first class based on a feeling?" Emily's jaw tightened. "I was being cautious." Dennis sighed, leaning against the counter. "Caution is fine. Prejudice isn't. You better hope that feeling doesn't come back to bite you." Emily said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the coffee pot. In economy, Ava remained composed, her every movement deliberate. She sipped her water, adjusted her notebook, and watched the flight attendants move through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She wasn't angry, at least. Not outwardly. Anger had never served her well. Instead, Ava focused on the bigger picture. She thought about the countless other passengers who had been treated as she had, but who lacked the resources or resolve to push back. For them, this was a routine humiliation, an invisible injustice that went unspoken, unchallenged. But Ava wasn't here to accept it. She was here to dismantle it. As the plane continued its journey, the tension rippled outward, subtle but undeniable. The passengers in first class exchanged murmurs, their curiosity piqued by Ava's abrupt relocation. The crew moved with an undercurrent of unease, their professional smiles faltering under the weight of the storm that was quietly brewing. And Ava sat in the eye of that storm, calm and composed, knowing that her time to act was drawing closer with every passing mile. The hum of the airplane engine seemed louder now, a constant undercurrent to the tension stretching between first class and the main cabin. Ava Johnson sat with the kind of calm that could only come from years of practice, her hands resting lightly on the closed notebook in her lap. But beneath her composed exterior, a storm brewed, a storm she wasn't rushing to unleash. Ava knew better than to act impulsively. She had seen how moments of righteous anger, justified as they might be, were often weaponized against people like her. So instead, she leaned into the silence, letting it stretch, waiting for the first crack to appear. It came, as it often did, from a place of authority. The in-flight phone buzzed in the galley, breaking the quiet rhythm of the flight. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, answered, his brow furrowing as he listened. After a brief exchange, he hung up and turned to Emily, who was busy folding napkins into neat squares. "That was the captain," Dennis said, his voice low but firm. "The airline's executive office called again. They want a detailed report on what happened with the first-class passenger you moved." Emily's hands froze mid-fold. "Why?" she asked, though the question was more reflex than curiosity. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "You don't know who she is, do you?" Emily straightened, her face flushing slightly. "I don't see what that has to do with anything," she said defensively. "It has everything to do with it," Dennis replied, his tone sharpening. "Ava Johnson isn't just a first-class passenger. She's connected to the board, to the people who make decisions about what happens to employees like you and me. If you didn't already know that, you're about to learn it the hard way." Emily swallowed hard, her composure slipping. "I was just doing my job," she muttered, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Were you?" Dennis shot back, his voice quieter now but no less cutting. "Or were you doing what you've been taught to do, what we've all been taught to do? You looked at her and saw someone who didn't fit, and instead of questioning that instinct, you acted on it." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She turned away, busying herself with the napkins again, though her hands trembled slightly. Back in the main cabin, Ava glanced at her watch. Time was moving slowly, each minute stretching into the next. She wasn't impatient, but she was acutely aware of the growing unease around her. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the whispered questions they didn't dare ask aloud. One man across the aisle leaned over, his voice low. "Excuse me, ma'am, I don't mean to pry, but, did something happen back there?" Ava met his gaze, her expression neutral. "Just a misunderstanding," she said simply, though her tone left little room for further inquiry. The man nodded, retreating into silence, but his curiosity lingered, unspoken yet palpable, like so many of the tensions that permeated the air. Ava's phone buzzed again, a message lighting up the screen. "We've escalated it. Expect contact soon." She read the message twice, then slipped the phone back into her bag. She wasn't surprised. She had known from the moment Emily approached her that this was bigger than one flight. Bigger than one moment. It always was. In first class, Emily's discomfort had grown into something almost physical. She moved through her duties with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. Her forced smile cracking under the pressure. Every time she glanced toward the galley, she expected Dennis to confront her again or worse, for the phone to buzz with another call. Finally, the crack came. "Emily," Dennis said, his voice quieter this time but no less firm. "The captain wants to see you." Emily's heart sank. She hesitated, her mind racing through excuses she might offer, defenses she might build, but she knew there was no way around it. With a deep breath, she smoothed her uniform and walked toward the cockpit. Captain Harris, a man with a calm but commanding presence, greeted her with a curt nod. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried the weight of authority. "Miss Brown," he began, folding his hands on the armrest of his seat. "I've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger. Can you explain what happened?" Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There was a misunderstanding about her ticket," she said finally. "I thought there had been a mistake, so I moved her to economy." Captain Harris raised an eyebrow. "Did you verify her ticket before making that decision?" Emily faltered. "No, sir, but you assumed," Harris interrupted, his tone sharper now. "You assumed because of how she looked, how she carried herself, that she didn't belong. Isn't that right?" Emily's face burned. "That's not what I meant. Intent doesn't matter," Harris cut in, his voice cold. "What matters is that you made a decision based on nothing more than your own assumptions. And now we're all dealing with the consequences. Miss Johnson isn't just a passenger. She's connected to the board. Do you understand what that means?" Emily nodded weakly, her throat tight. "It means," Harris continued, "that your actions have put this airline's reputation and your career at risk. When we land, you'll provide a full report to the ground team. Until then, I suggest you focus on performing your duties without further incident. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Harris dismissed her with a nod, and Emily retreated to the galley, her mind spinning. For the first time, the weight of her actions began to settle on her shoulders, not just the professional repercussions, but the personal ones as well. Meanwhile, Ava remained in her seat, her expression calm but her mind sharp. She could sense the tide turning, the subtle shifts in power and perception that signaled a larger reckoning. This wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about accountability, about forcing a system to confront its own biases, however deeply buried they might be. As the plane continued its journey, the tension only grew, rippling through the cabin like an invisible current. And Ava, sitting at the center of it all, knew that the real storm was yet to come. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the rhythmic hum of the engines masking the quiet tension threading through the cabin. Ava Johnson sat in her economy seat, a figure of composed stillness. To the casual observer, she appeared unbothered, her hands lightly resting on her notebook, her face turned toward the window. But within, a fire burned, a steady, controlled flame, waiting for the right moment to ignite. In first class, Emily Brown felt the weight of Captain Harris' words pressing down on her like an anvil. She had returned to her duties, but her movements were no longer fluid. Her hands fumbled as she poured coffee for a passenger, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She muttered an apology and quickly cleaned the mess. But the tightness in her chest wouldn't abate. Her earlier confidence, bolstered by her assumptions, had drained away. Every time she glanced toward the curtain separating first class from the main cabin, she felt a pang of unease. What was Ava Johnson doing back there? And more importantly, what was she planning? Ava, for her part, had no intention of rushing her next move. She flipped open her notebook and jotted down a few lines, her handwriting neat and deliberate. The words weren't meant for anyone but herself, an outline of thoughts, a reminder to stay focused. She had seen situations like this unfold too many times before. In boardrooms, restaurants, classrooms, they were all different, but the pattern was the same: assumptions made, lines crossed, dignity eroded. What separated Ava from many others, however, was her ability to wield those moments as tools for change. And this flight, this microcosm of societal fault lines, was no exception. Back in the galley, Dennis watched Emily with a quiet scrutiny. "You don't look okay," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Emily's hands tightened around the tray she was holding. "I'm fine," she snapped, though her tone lacked conviction. "Sure," Dennis replied, leaning against the counter, "because moving a first-class passenger based on nothing but a hunch always ends well." Emily shot him a glare. But she didn't respond. She couldn't. "Listen," Dennis continued, his voice softening. "I've been with this airline long enough to know when someone's about to step in it. And you, Emily, are ankle-deep and sinking fast. Whatever you thought you saw in her, you were wrong. And now, you got a decision to make. Do you own it, or do you dig in deeper?" Emily clenched her jaw, her pride wrestling with the dawning realization of her mistake. Meanwhile, Ava's phone buzzed softly in her lap. She glanced at the screen. "Call when you land. They'll be waiting at the gate." She smiled faintly, tucking the phone back into her bag. She wasn't looking for vengeance. Ava had never been interested in making people grovel. What she demanded was accountability. And accountability, she knew, required precision. The real challenge was never in calling out injustice. It was in making those who perpetuated it see themselves clearly. That was the harder fight, the one that didn't end with a public apology or a corporate memo. The curtain separating first class from the main cabin rippled as Emily stepped through it. Tray in hand, her steps were hesitant, her usual brisk confidence replaced by something closer to dread. She stopped beside Ava's seat, her smile brittle. "Miss Johnson," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Can I offer you something to drink? Perhaps a glass of sparkling water?" Ava turned slowly to face her, her expression calm but unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just enough to make Emily shift uncomfortably. "No, thank you," Ava said finally, her tone polite but firm. "I'm fine." Emily nodded, her forced smile faltering. "If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." "You've done quite enough," Ava interrupted, her voice still even but carrying an unmistakable edge. Emily flinched as though the words had struck her. And for a moment, she looked as if she might say something else. But instead, she nodded quickly and retreated back to the galley. The exchange didn't go unnoticed. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. Their curiosity piqued. Some whispered among themselves. Their words hushed but their tones speculative. "What do you think happened?" "Probably nothing. People make too big a deal out of everything these days. Still, you have to wonder." Ava ignored the murmurs, her focus returning to the notebook in her lap. This wasn't the time to engage. That moment would come, but it wouldn't be dictated by whispers or stares. In the galley, Emily leaned against the counter, her breathing uneven. "I tried," she said to Dennis, her voice low and strained. "Tried what?" Dennis asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "To fix it," Emily snapped. "I offered her a drink. Didn't I?" Dennis shook his head slowly. "A drink doesn't fix what you did, Emily. It's a band-aid on a bullet wound. And if you think that's going to make anyone forget, you're fooling yourself." Emily's frustration bubbled over. "Why does this have to be such a big deal? It was a mistake, okay? People make mistakes." Dennis crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "Sure, people make mistakes, but this wasn't just a mistake. Emily, this was a choice. And you're not the one paying for it, she is." The words hit harder than Emily expected. And for a moment, she couldn't speak. Back in the main cabin, Ava glanced at her watch. The flight was nearing its halfway point. But she felt no impatience. Every detail was falling into place. And she knew that the real reckoning would come after the plane touched down. She reached for her phone, typing out a brief message. "Almost there. Be ready." Sliding the phone back into her bag, she leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady as she looked out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly before her, their calm surface belying the storm that brewed within the confines of the plane. The airplane cabin hummed with activity as the flight approached its final stretch. Passengers adjusted their trays, flight attendants moved briskly between aisles, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. But beneath the surface of these everyday rhythms, an invisible tension simmered, unspoken but palpable. Ava Johnson, seated in the middle row of economy, felt it acutely. She always did. Ava had spent a lifetime navigating these spaces, where civility was a fragile mask that barely concealed the deeper truths underneath. She knew the looks, the whispers, The small but deliberate choices people made to remind her, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, that she didn't belong. Today, that reminder had come in the form of a flight attendant with a tight smile and an even tighter grip on her biases. Emily Brown, now back in the first-class galley, felt the walls closing in. Every move she made seemed scrutinized. Every glance from Dennis or the passengers a subtle accusation. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to steady herself, but the words of Captain Harris and Dennis kept echoing in her mind. "She's connected to the board. You looked at her and saw someone who didn't fit. You better hope this doesn't come back to bite you." Emily prided herself on being composed, professional, in control, but now, that control was slipping, and she didn't know how to get it back. In the main cabin, Ava's phone buzzed softly again. She glanced at the screen. "We'll be waiting at the gate. Handle it as you see fit." Ava's lips curved into a faint smile, not of triumph, but of quiet resolve. She slipped the phone back into her bag and leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the tray table. The hum of the engines filled her ears, a steady backdrop to the thoughts racing through her mind. A man seated across the aisle leaned toward her, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. "Excuse me," he said hesitantly. "I don't mean to intrude, but, was there an issue earlier? With your seat, I mean." Ava turned to him, her expression calm but guarded. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied, her tone polite but firm. The man nodded, sensing the boundaries in her words. But his curiosity lingered, the unspoken question hanging between them. "Why you?" That question, Ava knew, was at the heart of so many encounters like this one. It was the quiet thread that wove through boardrooms, waiting rooms, classrooms, and now this airplane cabin. It was the question that people asked with their eyes, their tone, their choices. "What are you doing here?" Back in the galley, Dennis cornered Emily again. "The captain called," he said bluntly. "Another update from the executive office. They want a full account of the incident as soon as we land." Emily froze, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. "What am I supposed to say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dennis shrugged, his gaze steady. "Say the truth, that you made a judgment call based on nothing but your own assumptions." Emily bristled. "I was trying to do my job." "No," Dennis said sharply. "You were trying to protect a version of first class that exists only in your head. And now, you've turned this flight into a spectacle." Emily's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and anger. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Dennis replied, "but it's also not as complicated as you want to make it. You looked at her, and you decided she didn't belong. That's the whole story." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. She turned away, pretending to busy herself with the drink cart. In the main cabin, Ava remained composed, but she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few avoided looking at all, as though ignoring the situation absolved them of any responsibility. Clara, the younger flight attendant assigned to economy, approached Ava again. Her kindness felt genuine, but Ava could see the hesitation in her eyes, the same hesitation she had seen in countless others who wanted to help but didn't know how. "Is there anything else I can get you, Miss Johnson?" Clara asked softly. Ava looked up, her smile faint but warm. "I'm fine, Clara, thank you." Clara hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded and stepped away. Ava watched her go, her thoughts turning to the layers of complicity that allowed moments like this to happen. It wasn't just Emily. After all, it was the culture that had taught Emily to act on her biases without question. It was the passengers who averted their eyes, the systems that reinforced those unspoken boundaries. It was the mask of civility, worn by so many, that allowed the deeper rot to remain hidden. The intercom crackled, and Captain Harris' voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement brought a flurry of activity as passengers adjusted their seats and secured their belongings. Ava sat back, her hands resting lightly on her notebook. She had no need to rush. The wheels of accountability were already in motion, and she trusted them to carry her forward. Emily, meanwhile, felt her chest tighten as the plane began its descent. Each passing moment brought her closer to the confrontation she knew was inevitable. She glanced toward the main cabin, her eyes landing on Ava. Ava met her gaze briefly. Her expression calm but unyielding. There was no malice in her eyes. But there was something far more unsettling, certainty. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Emily's hands trembled slightly. She smoothed her uniform for the 100th time, trying to steady herself, but deep down, she knew that her carefully constructed mask was slipping, and once it fell, there would be no putting it back on. In the terminal, as passengers began to disembark, Ava remained seated, her movements unhurried. She waited until the aisle was nearly empty before standing, gathering her belongings with deliberate care. At the front of the plane, Emily stood stiffly, forcing a smile as each passenger passed. When Ava reached her, Emily's voice faltered. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Johnson," she said, the words brittle. Ava paused, her gaze steady. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly, her tone carrying the weight of a promise. As Ava stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt the cool air of the jet bridge wash over her. She didn't look back. There was no need. She knew the ripples she had set in motion were already beginning to take shape. The cool air of the jet bridge greeted Ava Johnson like a reminder. The world outside the plane was no less fraught than the one she had just left behind. The hum of airport life surrounded her, the rumble of luggage wheels, announcements echoing through the terminal, the rhythmic shuffle of travelers navigating their journeys. Ava's steps were measured as she made her way toward the gate, each stride purposeful. Behind her, Emily Brown lingered near the plane's exit, her stiff posture betraying the turmoil beneath her composed facade. The moment Ava had stepped off the plane, Emily felt the weight of what was to come settle fully on her shoulders. "She's not done with this," Dennis said quietly, stepping up beside her. Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could feel it in her chest, a tightening, a reckoning. At the gate, Ava's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and saw the message she had been waiting for. "We're here, Terminal 3, near baggage claim." Ava allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She slipped her phone into her bag and continued walking, her pace unhurried. She knew there was no need to rush. The system she was challenging had operated for decades, centuries, even on the assumption that people like her would swallow indignities quietly, that they would look away, that they would let it pass. But Ava had never been one to let things pass. The terminal was bright and bustling, its energy almost overwhelming after the tense cocoon of the airplane cabin. Ava spotted the representatives from the airline's executive office immediately, a man in a tailored suit and a woman with a clipboard. Their expressions carefully neutral. They were stationed near a sleek seating area, their presence a quiet but unmistakable signal of the gravity of the situation. "Miss Johnson," the man said, stepping forward and extending a hand. His voice was smooth, polished, the kind of tone reserved for damage control. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I'm Richard Hale, Director of Customer Relations. This is my colleague, Anita Greer." Ava shook his hand, her grip firm but not aggressive. "Thank you for reaching out so promptly," she replied, her tone as calm and controlled as it had been throughout the flight. Anita gestured to the seating area. "Shall we sit?" Ava nodded and followed them to the small cluster of chairs. The conversation that unfolded was careful, deliberate. Hale and Greer expressed their deep regrets over the incident, assured Ava that the airline took such matters extremely seriously, and emphasized their commitment to ensuring every passenger feels respected and valued. Ava listened, her expression unreadable. She had heard words like these before in boardrooms, in meetings, in the hollow apologies of people who believed that polished language could erase systemic flaws. But Ava wasn't interested in platitudes. "This isn't about one flight attendant or one incident," Ava said finally, her voice calm but firm. "It's about a culture that allows people to act on their biases without accountability. You can't train that away with a workshop or a memo. It requires systemic change." Hale nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "We understand that, Miss Johnson, and we're committed to working with you to address these issues. I'll hold you to that," Ava replied, her gaze steady. As the meeting concluded, Ava rose from her seat and shook their hands once more. The exchange had been productive, but she knew the real work would begin after she walked away. Back at the gate, Emily's worst fears were coming true. Two security officers approached the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. "Are you Emily Brown?" one of them asked, his tone professional but firm. Emily nodded, her face pale. "We'll need you to come with us," the officer said. "There are some questions we need to address regarding the flight." Dennis watched silently as the officers escorted Emily away. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the moment. As Emily walked through the terminal flanked by security, she felt the stares of passengers following her like a spotlight. Whispers buzzed in the air, fragments of curiosity and judgment she couldn't escape. "What do you think she did? Must have been serious. I bet it was something about that woman in economy." Emily's mind raced, her heart pounding. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, to fix it, but the words that had come so easily before justifications, assumptions, excuses now felt brittle and meaningless. Ava stood near the baggage carousel, her phone in hand, as passengers from her flight began trickling into the terminal. She watched the flow of people quietly, her thoughts steady. The representatives had left, promising follow-up emails and detailed timelines for implementing changes. Ava knew some of their promises would be genuine, but she also knew how easily systems could revert to the status quo without constant pressure. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Emily being led through the terminal by security. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, Ava saw something she hadn't expected: regret. For the first time, Emily's mask of composure had cracked completely. There was no defiance, no defensiveness, just a raw, unguarded recognition of the weight of her actions. Ava's expression remained neutral, but inside, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness. Emily's actions had been too deliberate, too rooted in assumptions that went unchallenged for too long. But it was a reminder of the humanity buried beneath the harm. A complexity Ava had always understood, even when others didn't. As Emily disappeared from view, Ava turned back to the carousel. Her bag appeared moments later, and she lifted it with ease. Her movements deliberate. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and walked toward the exit. Her steps steady, her mind clear. The world outside the airport was as chaotic and flawed as the one inside. But Ava wasn't deterred. She knew the fight didn't end here. If anything, it was just beginning. The ride from the airport to the city felt unusually quiet. Ava Johnson sat in the back of a black sedan, her reflection ghosting across the car window as the urban sprawl blurred past. She'd made this trip countless times before, but tonight felt different. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness that lingered from the confrontation aboard the plane. Ava was accustomed to carrying these burdens. They followed her like shadows, invisible to some, oppressive to others. She glanced at her phone. A message from the airline's CEO, Richard Hale, waited on the screen. "Thank you for meeting with our team. I'd like to schedule a personal conversation at your earliest convenience." Ava read the message twice before tucking the phone back into her bag. The overtures of accountability had begun. Whether they were sincere or performative remained to be seen. At the airline's headquarters, Emily Brown sat in a small, sterile conference room, the walls painted a muted gray that seemed to drain the color from the space. She stared at the empty chairs across from her, waiting for the disciplinary committee to arrive. Her uniform, which once made her feel confident and capable, now felt constricting. Her badge, clipped neatly to her lapel, seemed heavier than usual. Emily had spent the hours since landing replaying every moment of the flight, searching for anything that might justify her actions. But the truth was stark and unrelenting. She had acted on instinct. And her instinct had been wrong. The door opened, and 3 executives entered the room. Their faces were unreadable, their movements brisk. They took their seats, and the sharp-featured woman in the center, introduced as Marjorie Clark, began without preamble. "Miss Brown," Marjorie said, her tone clipped, "we're here to review the events of Flight 287, specifically your decision to reassign Miss Ava Johnson from first class to economy. Let's start with your reasoning. Why did you make that decision?" Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I believed there had been a mistake with her booking," she said. "And did you verify this mistake?" Marjorie asked, her gaze unyielding. "No," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Another committee member, a man in glasses, leaned forward. "Miss Brown, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions violated that policy and have resulted in a formal complaint not only from Miss Johnson but from other passengers who witnessed the incident. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Emily's mind raced, but no defense came to her. She had no words, no excuses that could explain away the truth of what she'd done. She faltered, then stopped, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I made a mistake. In the heart of the city, Ava sat in her office, surrounded by the quiet hum of her team wrapping up for the day. Papers were stacked neatly on her desk, but her focus was elsewhere. Her assistant, Maya, entered with a folder. The initial review from the airline, Maya said, placing it on Ava's desk. They're recommending mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, starting immediately. Ava opened the folder and scanned the document. The language was measured, almost cautious, as though the airline was walking a tightrope between addressing the issue and minimizing liability. It's a start, Ava said finally, closing the folder. But it's not enough. Maya hesitated. Do you think they'll follow through? They'll have to, Ava replied, not because they want to, but because they know they can't afford not to. The question is whether it'll last once the headlines fade. Later that evening, Emily sat in her small apartment, the letter of suspension resting on the table in front of her. The committee's decision had been swift and final. She was to be suspended without pay pending further review. Her chest tightened as she read the words again. She had spent years building her career, working long hours, climbing the ladder one careful step at a time. And now, it felt as though it had all crumbled in an instant. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from her mother. A short but pointed question. Are you okay? Emily stared at the message for a long time before typing a response. I don't know. The next day, Ava met with Richard Hale in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. The CEO was a tall, silver-haired man with a polished demeanor that exuded authority. Miss Johnson, Hale began, his tone measured. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of the airline. What you experienced was unacceptable, and we are taking steps to ensure it never happens again. Ava nodded but said nothing. She had learned long ago to let people speak first. It revealed more than they often intended. We've already initiated a review of our training programs, Hale continued. We're implementing mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all employees. And we're revisiting our reporting processes to ensure incidents like this are addressed swiftly and appropriately. Ava leaned forward, her gaze steady. That's a good start, she said, but training alone won't fix the problem. What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger culture that allows people to act on their biases without accountability. If you want real change, you'll need to go deeper. Hale nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. What do you suggest? Transparency, Ava replied. Commit to tracking and publishing data on complaints, incidents, and resolutions. Show your employees and your customers that you're serious about holding people accountable. Hale considered her words, then nodded again. We can do that. Back at her apartment, Emily stared at her computer screen. She had spent hours drafting an apology, rewriting each sentence until the words blurred together. Finally, she hit send. The email was addressed to Ava. It was short, sincere, and unflinchingly honest. Miss Johnson, I owe you an apology. My actions were wrong, and I deeply regret the harm they caused. I've spent the past day reflecting on my decisions, and I realize now how much I let my assumptions guide me. I am truly sorry, and I am committed to learning from this experience. Sincerely, Emily Brown. When Ava received the email, she read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. She didn't respond immediately. She understood the weight of an apology. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step. That evening, as she sat in her office, the city lights twinkling outside the window, Ava thought about the path ahead. The challenges weren't over. The systems that had allowed this incident to happen were still in place, still entrenched. But for the first time in a long while, Ava felt a glimmer of hope. Change was slow, often painful, but it was possible. Baldwin once wrote, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." Ava Johnson knew this to be true, but she also knew that history could be rewritten not in sweeping gestures, but in the quiet, deliberate actions of those who refused to accept the world as it was. The day was warm, the kind of warmth that felt heavier in the heart of a city. Ava Johnson stood on the steps of her building, a sleek, towering structure that reflected the sunlight in blinding streaks. The air carried the sounds of distant traffic and murmured conversations. But Ava was focused on the present moment. Her phone vibrated in her hand. The notification was from the airline. Public statement released. Thank you for your guidance. Ava opened the link and scanned the statement, a carefully crafted acknowledgement of the incident on Flight 287. Coupled with promises of systemic change. It spoke of commitment to equity and transparency. And it outlined specific measures, enhanced bias training, clear accountability protocols, and a public reporting initiative for incidents involving discrimination. Ava knew the words were just that, words. Change wasn't birthed from press releases, it was fought for, demanded, and sustained by relentless pressure. Still, this moment wasn't meaningless. It was a crack in the armor of a long-entrenched system. In a modest apartment across the city, Emily Brown read the same statement. Her heart sank as she saw the story taking shape in the media. Flight attendant under fire for discrimination. Airline promises overhaul following incident. Her name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Her actions were the catalyst. And she bore the brunt of the backlash. Her suspension, once a bureaucratic formality, now felt like a sentence, a public reminder of her failure. Emily opened her laptop. She had avoided social media since the incident, fearing the wave of criticism she knew was waiting for her. But tonight, she didn't look away. She scrolled through the headlines, the comment sections, the think pieces dissecting her actions. Her defensiveness, once so strong, had begun to erode. In its place was something rawer, more painful. The realization that she had become part of the problem she always claimed to oppose. A week later, Ava stood at the front of a conference room filled with airline executives. Her presence was commanding, her voice calm but firm as she outlined a roadmap for meaningful change. The executives listened intently, their faces a mix of agreement and unease. This isn't about appeasing the public, Ava said, her gaze sweeping the room. It's about creating a culture where incidents like this don't happen in the first place. That requires more than policies. It requires a willingness to look at the biases baked into your systems and ask hard questions about who those systems serve and who they exclude. The room was silent, save for the sound of pens scratching against paper. Ava didn't pause. You have an opportunity to set a precedent, she continued, not just for this airline, but for the entire industry. But it won't happen unless you're willing to confront the realities you've been ignoring. When Ava finished, the room broke into cautious applause. She accepted it with a nod, knowing the applause was the easy part. For Emily, the reckoning came in smaller, quieter moments. A conversation with a neighbor who asked about her suspension. A call from her mother, who didn't offer sympathy, but instead asked, "What are you going to do to make it right?" Emily began attending workshops on bias and equity. Not because they were mandated, but because she needed to understand how she had failed. The sessions were uncomfortable, forcing her to confront parts of herself she had long ignored. She thought often about Ava Johnson, her calmness, her poise, her refusal to let the incident pass without consequence. Emily didn't expect forgiveness, but she hoped, one day, to be worthy of it. Months passed. The airline's new measures began to take shape. Ava remained involved, consulting on training programs, reviewing accountability reports, and ensuring that the promises made weren't quietly forgotten. The ripple effects extended beyond the airline. Other companies began examining their own policies, prompted by the public attention the incident had garnered. Ava's name became synonymous with change, not as a victim, but as a force for accountability. But for Ava, the work was never about recognition. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the indignities she had faced. One evening, Ava received an unexpected email. It was from Emily. The message was brief but heartfelt. "Miss Johnson, I wanted to thank you not just for holding me accountable, but for showing me the importance of confronting my own biases. I've spent the past months reflecting and learning. And while I know I can't undo the harm I caused, I hope to use this experience to do better. Sincerely, Emily Brown." Ava read the email twice before setting her phone down. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat in the quiet of her office, letting the weight of the moment settle. Forgiveness wasn't something Ava gave lightly. But in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. Weeks later, Ava boarded another flight. This time, she was greeted warmly by the staff. Her seat in first class prepared with care. She noticed small changes in the crew's behavior: more attentiveness, more empathy, As the plane ascended, Ava leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, not just the flight, but the larger journey of fighting for a world where dignity wasn't conditional. Baldwin once wrote, "The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in." Ava understood that now, more than ever, the fight wasn't over, it never would be. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel before: hope. And sometimes, hope was enough to keep going. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.